Okay, Chapter 1, Section 3, Part 2. I forgot to tell you guys yesterday that Section 3 is a two-part section. Part 2 talks about a reflection. So we talked about all the other moves that a graph can have in Part 1. Reflection is the only one we have left. So reflection occurs when a parameter that stretches or compresses, so either your A or your B, the function is negative. An even function is when f of negative x equals f of x, and an odd function is when f of negative x equals negative f of x. So those are two different things, and they are based off of the reflections. A function can also be neither even or odd, nor odd. So if we look at a reflection, like I said, if something is happening to the outside of the function, so like here, we're going to have g of x equals a times f of x. And in our case, a is going to be negative 1. So if something happens on the outside of the function, it is going to affect your y values. So if we look here, we have our original points that I graphed all yesterday and all today in class. But when we go to say a of negative 1, we're going to multiply that negative 1 by each of these y values. So negative 2 times negative 1 gives me 2. 2 times negative 1 gives me negative 2. Negative 2 times negative 1 is going to give me 2. And 2 times negative 1 is going to give me that negative 2. So 2, negative 2. So then, my graph, I'm going to plot these x values and these y values. So negative 1, I'm going to be at 2. 1, I'm going to be at negative 2. At 3, I'm going to be at 2. And at 5, I'm going to be at negative 2. So when I go to graph this reflection, you can see that it is totally flipped over the x-axis. So the graph g of x equals negative f of x is a reflection over the x-axis. Okay. Let's look at another one. This time, we're going to be focusing on the b value. So remember, the b value is inside the function. So that means it's going to change my input values. It's going to focus on my x values. So our function this time, g of x equals f of 1 over b times x. B is going to be negative 1. So if you look up here, I have f of 1 over negative 1 times x, which is the same as saying f of negative x. So this time my y values are still going to be the same as the f of x. The f of x values stay the same. However, these are going to change. So since b is negative 1, in order to go from x to g of x, I'm going to multiply by negative 1. So to go from negative 1 to get to 1, negative 1 times 1 is going to give me 1. 1 times negative 1 gives me negative 1. 3 times negative 1 is going to give me negative 3. And 5 times negative 1 is going to give me negative 5. So I'm going to plot then this column and this column. So my first point is 1, negative 2. My second point is going to be negative 1, 2. My third point is going to be -3, -2. And my fourth point is going to be -5, 2. So this time, you will see that our graph has been reflected over the y-axis. So when g of x equals f of -x, you reflect over the y-axis. Okay. So just to recap on what each of these parameters do, remember our parameters have been a, b, h, and k. I'm going to have this little chart down here. So k, if it's positive, it's going to move up on the y-axis. If it's a negative k, it's going to move down on the y-axis. If h is positive, meaning that in the parentheses it would look like x minus h. H is positive in that case. It's going to move right on the x-axis. And if it is negative, so it would read x plus h, it's going to move left on the x-axis. And I know that's kind of squeezed. Zoom in a little bit. So k, if it's positive, it moves up on the y. If it's negative, it moves down on the y. If h is positive, but it looks like x minus h, it's going to move right on the x-axis. And if it's negative, it would look like x plus h, and it's going to move left on the x-axis. Okay? If a, so if my a is greater than 0, it's a vertical stretch. So it's going away from the x-axis. Again, we'll zoom in a little bit. So it's going to go away from the x-axis. If a is between 0 and 1, so if it was like 1/2, it's a vertical compress. So it's moving towards the x-axis. It's getting smaller, it's shrinking. If a is less than 0, like we just learned, that's going to be a reflect across the x-axis. Okay, and finally, with b, if b is greater than 0, it's going to be a horizontal stretch. So away from the y-axis. If b is between 0 and 1, it's going to be a horizontal compress. So it's going to shrink. And it's going to go towards the y-axis. And if b is less than 0, like we just learned, that's a reflect across the y-axis. Okay, so there's your little recap for K, H, A, and B. And that's it for section 3. Your homework did change on the agenda. You don't have to do numbers 14, 16, or 18. Instead, I just want you guys to do numbers 10 and 12. So your homework has changed. Just page 32, numbers 10 and 12. That's all you have to do for your homework, plus the 1.3 worksheet, and that is being turned in. So remember, worksheets are being turned in. 1.3 worksheet to be turned in by 11:59, Wednesday, the 30th. And these 2 homework problems need to be done and put in your notebook.